Good evening. It's my pleasure, it's my privilege, dear friends, colleagues, dear Professor Lewis, to welcome to the second annual Bernard Lewis lecture. 2 weeks ago, Professor Lewis spoke with us about periodization of history, and as you remember, he stopped at a point and promised us to continue from the point he stopped last time today. And indeed, I'm very pleased to invite Professor Lewis to continue his lecture, speaking today on choices for the Middle East. So without any further ado, Professor Lewis, please.
Thank you. My title this week is, shall we say, a little more sexy than the one I chose last time. And let me explain what I propose to do, and more specifically and more importantly, what I do not propose to do. Two things I shall not attempt to do. One is to predict the future, the other is to offer advice. What I shall try to do is what I think may be more legitimately expected of a professional historian, that is to say, to try to identify the factors, the elements in the situation, which will define and delimit the choices that we have. To try to look at these as far as they are visible, ascertainable, describable, and to see what these factors are, where they may lead, what the possibilities are. What actually happens, of course, is another matter, and I leave that to a higher authority to determine. Let me begin by reviewing the outside factors, that's to say factors not actually in the Middle East, factors outside the Middle East, which will, in a sense, as I said before, define and delimit the choices. And one turns naturally in the first instance to Europe, which has played a predominant, sometimes a dominant role in Middle Eastern affairs for almost 200 years. But that phase has ended. I see little possibility of Europe playing any sort of role in Middle Eastern affairs in the immediate future. The more interesting and more relevant question, I think, is what role will the Middle East play in European affairs? I turn now to the second, that's to say, in historical sequence, the second external factor, and that is America. There is a great deal of talk nowadays, especially in Middle Eastern countries, but by no means exclusively in Middle Eastern countries. Is this working properly? Well, what is the answer? Because I seem to be getting an echo. It echoes.
Yeah, but I think it's some of the mobiles, they don't. Okay, I do suggest that everybody will now shut down his mobile, and I think maybe it will help us.
Is that any better?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Thank you. So I come back to America as a factor. As perceived by some, America is the successor of the West European empires, and more particularly the British Empire, in the long sequence of infidel powers that have sought to dominate the heartlands of Islam. One hears a great deal in the Middle East, and to some extent elsewhere, of American imperialism. This is a term which is both inaccurate and misleading, and reveals, I think, a lack of understanding both of what America is about and of what the word imperialism means. For a better understanding, I can go back to the history classes in my primary school, where I began history education. When the Romans came to Britain some 2,000 years ago, And when the British went to India a few hundred years ago, an exit strategy was not uppermost in their minds. They had quite a different purpose, a different intention, and they stayed for a long time. If one looks at the more detailed criticism that are levied against America or American policies in the Middle East and so on, the particular charge is not so much that America is engaging in imperialism as that America is failing to meet its imperial responsibilities. In other words, the assumption is that there has to be an imperial power, a successor to the British and French empires. That is the role in which history has cast America, and the Americans are failing to do it. In considering the possible role of America, I am inevitably reminded of a remark made by a Turkish general at a dinner party in Ankara very shortly after Turkey joined NATO in 1952, I think it was. He was asked how he felt about this new alliance, and he said, and I remember it vividly, he said, the problem with having the Americans as your allies is you never know when they'll turn around and stab themselves in the back. I have often been reminded of that wise saying, particularly in recent years and months and days, in following the course of events in the region, and more particularly in the United States. The future role of America in the Middle East is probably the most difficult of all the things that I'm discussing today to predict. I would say that on the whole, America is probably more likely not to play than to play a major, still less a dominant role in the region. I see a growing reluctance to become involved in this troublesome region, a growing anxiety in considering all the different matters in which the United States is involved, to look first and foremost at how do we get out of here. And it seems to me, then, therefore, that the United States' role in the Middle East will be limited to certain interest groups, to certain specific interests, and to one or two other factors. Let me just enumerate these as a reminder. Specific interest groups, obviously the Jews, the famous or infamous Jewish lobby. It's by no means the only lobby. There are other lobbies that have been much more active, but much less talked about. Another group with an interest in this area is the Christian Evangelicals. And to these we may now increasingly add a third, the growing Muslim population in the United States, who will have their own interest, their own concerns about what is happening in this part of the world. What specific interests does America have in the region? Well, what immediately comes to mind is oil. I'll come back to that a little later, talking about internal matters. Trade is not vastly important. There are other regions with much greater importance. Strategy, that was very important during the Cold War, but since then, the Middle East has lost most of its strategic importance, except, of course, for Middle Easterners. There is another element of American influence, rather just happening rather than through any wish or effort by the United States, and that is what those who dislike it call cultural imperialism. The enormous impact of American popular culture in the region, which grows day by day, affecting people in even the most unlikely settings. I'm told, for example, that in Iran, where satellites are forbidden, the Basij, the young revolutionary guards, go around with orders to destroy any satellites. They are bribed to tolerate the satellites, the price being a free seat to watch their favorite program. And the most popular program, so I am told, is Baywatch. American cultural imperialism, as its critics call it, is an important, rapidly growing, one might almost say overwhelming factor in much of the region. And that will probably be the most important single American involvement in these choices. What about Russia? Difficult to say. At the moment, Russia doesn't count for much. But I can't believe that a country of the size, the numbers, the resources of Russia will be content to remain on the sidelines of history. They will be back. They are already trying, so far not very effectively, in various ways to reassert themselves in the region. They will certainly continue those efforts, and they have a number of things on which they can draw, including something which they didn't have before, and that is Russian populations within Middle Eastern countries. I won't be more specific at this point. How Russia will return, when Russia will return, what role Russia will play, and perhaps most important of all, what kind of Russia will it be? All these are still very uncertain. I mention it as one of the factors that will define and delimit choices. So far I've spoken only of Europe, America, Russia, but there is another outside factor, hitherto in the main disregarded, but growing in importance, and that is the wider Muslim world. The Middle East is no longer the center of the Muslim world, demographically, economically, and increasingly even intellectually. There are now vast Muslim populations elsewhere, and particularly in two regions, in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Growing importance in numbers. Indonesia alone has twice the population of the entire Arab world. And they are becoming increasingly, how shall I put it, conscious of their own role. Here again I am reminded of a conversation which I had many years ago in Pakistan. I was attending an Islamic conference in Lahore, and mostly people from Muslim countries, but with a sprinkling of Orientalists, a profession which had not yet fallen into disrepute at that time. And one evening we were very surprised to be invited, we being myself and about 3 or 4 of my colleagues from Western countries, we were very surprised to receive an invitation from the great Maulana Abul Ala Maududi, one of the leading Muslim intellectuals of the time, the founder of the Jama'ah Islamiyah, with enormous influence all over the Muslim world. And he talked to us about various matters, and then mostly polite formalities. And then he said, "You Orientalists, you all make the same mistake." And I thought to myself, oh, here it comes, the usual. I was quite wrong. He said, all of you learn Arabic, many of you learn Persian, a few of you learn Turkish, and you think that with that you can understand Islam. This was true, it is no longer true. He said, today the center of the Islamic world is here. And if you want to know the important developments that are happening in Islam, you must learn Urdu. I found this a rather remarkable statement coming from him. And much that has happened since then has confirmed the impression that I received from that conversation. A growing impatience in South Asia and still more in Southeast Asian Islam with the nonsense from the Middle East. I found this particularly in Indonesia. But it's manifest also in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, and more particularly among the huge Muslim minority population in India. There are certain new elements which we have to add to those that I've already mentioned, and two in particular, India and China, two major Asian powers becoming superpowers, and if, as is not impossible, Islam and Christendom destroy each other, then these will be the dominant powers of the second half of the 21st century, and world domination will be either shared or disputed between them. Both of them have Muslim minorities. In China, rather a small one along the Central Asian frontiers. In India, a very large one. As I remarked a moment ago, the second largest Muslim community in the world. Both of them with frontiers with the Islamic world. Both with increasingly direct concerns with what goes on in the Muslim world. China and India are already beginning to show much more interest in what happens in the Middle East, and I have no doubt that in the years to come they will become much more directly involved, particularly if, as I believe is most likely, they become the dominant powers in the world in the late 21st century. Apart from these two new superpowers, I would add a third new external factor, and that is the new Muslim minorities in the non-Muslim world. And I'm speaking in particular of the Muslim minorities in Europe and in America. These are a new phenomenon, something which hasn't happened before. When the Ottomans retreated from Europe, they did leave small minorities behind, but nothing of any great consequence. When the Arabs were driven out of Spain and Portugal and Sicily, they left nothing behind. The Inquisition saw to that. But now there are new Muslim minorities growing up, and growing very rapidly by a powerful combination of migration and demography. And they are becoming keenly aware of the opportunities that they have as citizens of the European and American democracies, increasingly aware that it is possible for them, and as many of them see it, it is a duty on their part to play an increasing role in the affairs of their Middle Eastern homelands. This is a new factor. It's too early to evaluate or measure it, but one can see the beginnings of it, and I have no doubt that it will grow. Let me turn now to the internal regional factors and begin with the economic one. And here, of course, by far the most important immediate question is oil. The impact of oil has been in many ways devastating. In both ways. It has been devastating in the outside world, in ways that I don't need to tell you. It has also been devastating inside the oil-producing countries by strengthening autocratic governments and by making it far more difficult to develop any kind of democratic institutions. Everybody is familiar with the old American formula, no taxation without representation. What we sometimes forget is that the converse is also true. No representation without taxation. Governments that dispose of enormous oil revenues don't need to levy taxes on their people. They don't need to impose income tax, and therefore they don't need parliaments to help them in that process. So that oil has been an enormous strengthening of autocracy in the oil-producing countries, giving them independence in their own countries and an increasingly powerful voice in world affairs. If one considers the two aspects of this right away, one is the direct influence which the supply of oil gives them on world affairs, and the other, the enormous wealth that it brings them, wealth beyond the dreams of avarice, hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and all the things that can be done and are being done with that wealth. The very different things, institutions, individuals, and so on, that can be bought in one way or another and controlled. It's also devastating internally in a more directly economic respect, in that it has inhibited economic development in other areas. With this enormous source of unlimited wealth, why bother to develop anything else? You don't need it. Now, oil is not eternal. Sooner or later, oil will be either exhausted or superseded. This is a mineral resource. It is not unlimited. I'm no expert on the amounts or the use, but clearly, sooner or later, there will be none left. But I don't think we'll have to wait that long. There is already a very considerable movement to make oil obsolete. The development of alternative sources of energy, solar energy, wind energy, wave energy, the waves of the sea, and of more immediate relevance, ethanol and methanol, liquid alcohol which you can use in the gas tank of a car. This has already made tremendous progress. There are now many ways, very effective, cheap and efficient ways of producing usable fuels from various vegetable products, or even in the case of methanol, from organic waste. There are enormous oil resources in garbage. Think, for example, of the great masses of leaves that are thrown away and destroyed every autumn. It is perfectly possible to extract methanol, which can be used in a fuel tank. A lot of work is being done on that in America and elsewhere. The problems are being tackled one by one. The first problem, of course, was to produce a usable fuel. This is now being done in several different ways. The second one is to produce it in a form that it can be used in a car or other machine which uses petrol. And this again has been done successfully. The main problem at the present moment is the question of refills. You can buy a car which will run on either petrol or methanol or ethanol. The problem is getting refills when you travel. And since the filling stations all over the world are controlled by the oil companies, there is obviously, therefore, shall we say, a built-in obstacle on that particular point. But I have no doubt that sooner or later the world will tire of the tyranny of oil. And these other fuels, which are already, as I said, scientifically possible and in some areas already in use. There are cars running on ethanol and methanol, for example. That they will triumph and oil will become obsolete. And then, of course, the countries of the Middle East that have relied so heavily on oil as a source of revenue, as a source of power, will face a really acute crisis. Which way will they go? I'm not offering any prediction of when this will happen, but I don't think it'll be too long. As I say, the progress that is being made on oil replacements is already quite significant. And then the countries of the Middle East, particularly those with oil-based economies, will face an acute crisis. In some places, notably, for example, in the Gulf states, they are preparing for that. They are trying to build up alternative forms of economic activity, leading to alternative sources of income in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and the like. In Saudi Arabia or Iran, one doesn't see very much along those lines. And therefore, one is left wondering what will be the pattern of Middle Eastern economic life after the ending of the oil era. Two models come to mind. One is the Korean model. Korea, which was sunk in medieval torpor under Japanese colonial rule, which emerged and very rapidly developed into a major world economic power. And the other model is that of the more devastated parts of Africa. Will the Middle East in the post-oil era, will it follow the Korean model, or will it follow the African model? Question. I'm not offering any answers. Apart from the economic, there are other elements too. The strategic one. As I said before, with the ending of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, what you might call the classical East-West confrontation has ended, at least for the time being. But there are other possibilities. And one already sees signs of a Chinese-Indian rivalry affecting the borderlands that immediately concern them in Central Asia and the northwest frontier of India, and possibly extending before that. A new strategic situation will require new strategic evaluations and policies. I wouldn't attempt to define them at this stage, merely to draw attention to this question, which will certainly arise. There will also be enormous cultural and social challenges. Influences from outside, bringing change. And the most important of these is the communications revolution, which has already had an enormous impact in the Middle East. And with the spread of the internet and various other modern forms of communication, I think this is again going to be a major factor. Perhaps the most important factor of all in the future of the Middle East is one which has hitherto been totally disregarded, namely women, slightly more than half the population. A very large proportion of the women of the Middle East seem to be content, I stress the word seem, with the role assigned to them in traditional society. But there are murmurs of change, murmurs of resentment, of rebellion against this. And there are, I think, significant that in the Arab world, Iraq is the country where women have probably fared best. I'm not talking about rights, a word which has no meaning at all in that society. I'm talking about opportunity and access. In Iraq, women, more than in any other Arab country, had the opportunity to go to college, to enter the professions, to play a role in public life. And it seems to me that that is probably one of the most hopeful features in the Iraqi situation at the present time. One finds a similar, though lesser, development in Tunisia, another country where female emancipation has gone very far. Add this to the communications revolution of which I spoke a moment ago, and you will see the possibilities for the future in this. And remember, women are, as Nama Kemal pointed out 150 years ago, they are slightly more than half the population. They are also the mothers of the other half. And then there's another totally new element in the region, which I hardly know how to describe, let alone to assess. That is the new immigrant populations, which we find especially in the oil-producing countries, in the Gulf states and so on. A very large immigrant population, sometimes from other parts of the Middle East, but also to a quite considerable extent from South Asia and from Southeast Asia. If you go in the Gulf states, you will find a lot of things being done by Indians or by people from Malaysia or Indonesia and so on. These are increasingly numerous, increasingly active, increasingly vital to the continuing functioning of these societies. At the moment, they are completely disenfranchised. But that doesn't mean very much in a society where nobody has any political rights. But that, too, is changing and will change. And one may expect, I think, interesting developments among the new, I was going to say minorities, but in some places they are already majorities. And these new non-Arab or non-Muslim, sometimes both, populations from outside in some of the crucial areas of the Middle East. Which path will they take? Will it be assimilation or rebellion? That is a choice which they will make, depending on the choices made by their masters and rulers. Which brings me to the larger question of internal choices, the choices which the peoples of the Middle East, even in the majority of countries which have no democratic institutions worthy of the name, nevertheless they will have to make choices. And I've divided the choices into three main groups. Group one, Islamic militancy of one sort or another. This comes in several versions. The one most in evidence at the present time is the Wahhabi version, the dominant school of Saudi Arabia, and therefore enjoying immense resources, the power and prestige of the Saudi state and dynasty, and the wealth of Saudi oil being used all over the Muslim world, and even more effectively outside the Muslim world, to promote this particular version of Islam. I say more effectively because inside the Muslim world, they have learned how to deal with this kind of thing. Outside, they haven't. As they used to say in Moscow, it's no accident, comrades, that of 12 Turks who have been arrested as members of Al-Qaeda, all 12 were born and educated in Germany, not one in Turkey. In Turkey, they know how to deal with things. In Germany, they don't. And Germans, of course, are also inhibited by their own record from any kind of serious repression. The Saudi Wahhabi version comes in several sub-variants, the most notorious of which, of course, is the Osama bin Laden version, which is an outgrowth from the Saudi Wahhabi version. I was assured by no less a person than Gaddafi that Al-Qaeda is a branch of Saudi intelligence and Osama bin Laden is a high Saudi official. I don't think I would go that far. But there is obviously an affinity between them. They are different branches from the same tree. The second brand of Islamic militancy in the world today is, of course, the Iranian revolutionary version. Particularly in recent years, since Ahmadinejad became president, and since they have adopted this, what I think can be best described as this apocalyptic perception of the situation of the world in which we find ourselves at the present day. And this, again, has enormous following all over the place. Some years ago, I was invited to lecture, to go on a lecture tour of Islamic universities in Indonesia. And visiting the students' quarters, I was disagreeably surprised to find Khomeini's portrait on the walls all over the place. Indonesia is a solidly Sunni country, but nevertheless, this idea of the great Islamic revolution had its appeal for many students. I think the subsequent evolution of the Islamic revolution, which like the Russian and French revolutions has gone through various phases, I would say it's now in the Stalin phase. This has had a somewhat dampening effect on enthusiasm elsewhere, but it still remains an important factor. The third version of Islam currently being offered is reform. The idea of, how shall I put it, a moderate modern Islam compatible with free institutions, with democratic society, and so on. This has its followers, and they have certain arguments, which I will come to in a moment. It is not a powerful movement. Its extent of support is very difficult to estimate, since in most Muslim countries it is ruthlessly repressed. But it is there, there's no doubt about that. And from time to time there are encouraging signs that a reformed Islam, a new interpretation of Islam is a possibility. Now, I've spoken, in talking of the internal choices, I've spoken only of the religious one. There is, of course, what I was going to say secular, but I hesitate to use that word in an Islamic context. It is an extremely Christian term which doesn't apply. Let's say the national and patriotic one. In the Western world, for many, many centuries now, it has been customary to define identity by nationality, by country or nation. In American usage, the two words are synonymous. In British usage, they are not. Nation is people, country is place. I remember when I first went to the United States, how shocked I was when a colleague at the university told me that during the summer he was planning to drive across the nation, which in my language suggested the massive ill treatment of large numbers of people. Thank you. The notions of country and nation were both new to the Islamic world. The notion of country was so new, excuse me, that a very large proportion of the countries don't even have a name in Arabic. If you look at the extremely rich historical literature, as I remarked last time, you don't find histories of countries or of nations. This is a new idea. It came from Europe, and it brought with it the notion, the idea of identity and loyalty by the nation, that is nationalism, and identity and loyalty by the country, that is patriotism. Both of these ideas, country and nation, and both of these loyalties, nationalism and patriotism, are comparatively new to the region. Nationalism was able to adjust much more readily because it was fitted better with the religious and Islamic background. The adjustment from Islamic identity to national identity was comparatively easy. If you do it by country, that means you share an identity with all those awful people who live next door, and in the various ghettos and so on. This created problems. I would say that Iran is probably the country where the sense of patriotism is most strongly developed. But that is, as they used to say, no accident. Iran is the only real country in that vast area. Most of the other countries of the Middle East were artificial creations drawn on maps with rulers by mostly British and French statesmen and bureaucrats. Iran is a real country. It's been there for thousands of years. It has a strong corporate sense of identity. And therefore, I think that in Iran what we face is not so much nationalism as patriotism, a very different thing. And I think that in dealing with Iran, it would be wise to bear this in mind. However, the new national or patriotic identity will again raise certain new questions. For example, frontier questions. In the past, frontier questions were not terribly important. Frontiers were mostly desert areas, no well-defined frontiers. The idea of a frontier drawn on the map is a recent importation from Europe. But now it's become an issue, and there are frontier disputes all over the Middle East and North Africa between various states. And these sometimes also raise questions of ethnicity as well as of strategy. Ethnicity also raises regional questions. Again, to come to the example of Iran. Iran is one country, but it is composed of many different ethnic groups. If you go around the country, you have the Azeris, the Kashgai, the Baluchis, and so many other groups, each with its own language, its own ethnic identity. What is remarkable, I think, about the Iranian case is that so far they do genuinely seem to be bound together by a common Iranian loyalty and patriotism. Though if the present regime continues, they may well undermine that. There are regional problems of the same, or potential problems of the same sort elsewhere. Two in particular. In the modern period, with the general acceptance of nationality and ethnicity as defining identity and loyalty, a whole series of new states and nations have come into being. But there are two important ethnic groups, or should I say two important national groups, that have never achieved statehood: the Kurds and the Berbers. The Berbers in North Africa. The Kurds are to be found in Iraq, Iran, Syria, Turkey, and some of the Transcaucasian republics. Kurdish is a distinct language. It is of the Iranian family, related to Persian, but different, and very different from either Arabic or Turkish. And the Kurds came within distance of achieving a national state, but for a variety of reasons that possibility was not accomplished. Today you have an increasingly resentful Kurdish population, divided between a number of states who feel that they alone have been discriminated against, they alone have not been given what everybody else in the region has had, that's to say, a sovereign national state of their own. One may expect that this question of the Kurds will become more and more acute in the years to come. The other group that I mentioned are the Berbers. These are in North Africa, starting in Libya all the way across to Morocco. These are a group of closely related peoples, speaking closely related languages of the Berber family. These were the indigenous inhabitants of North Africa before the Arabs came in the 7th century. They have preserved their languages. Berber is still widely spoken. It is very different from Arabic. And like the Kurds, they have never had a state of their own since the advent of Islam and since the early Islamic empires. In North Africa, too, there is a growing Berber consciousness, which expresses itself in various ways. They still have a long way to go before they reach even the Kurdish level. But it's there and it's happening. And this, again, will be a factor of some importance in the future for that region, with impact inevitably on other regions too. Well, I spoke about religion, I spoke about nationality. You might say, well, what about democracy? What are the chances for democracy in the Middle East? There are arguments and there are pieces of historical evidence for and against. One line is to say, well, looking at the corrupt tyrannies that rule most of the region, they say that's how they are, that's how they've always been, there's nothing we can do about it, and we just have to achieve the best relationship possible with these people. This, curiously, is known as the pro-Arab attitude. In fact, of course, it's nothing of the kind. It shows ignorance of the Arab past, contempt for the Arab present, and unconcern for the Arab future. This kind of tyranny, this kind of dictatorship, is not indigenous to the Middle East. It was introduced from Europe in stages by the 19th century reformers with the best of intentions and trying to modernize, and by doing so did two harmful things. They increased the power of the central state, and they limited or eliminated those elements in society which had previously served as limits, as constraints on the power of the state. The second stage, we can date precisely 1940. The Vichy surrender, the Germans turn up in force in the Middle East, established themselves in Syria, moved from Syria to Iraq, where Rashid Ali set up a Nazi-type regime. Those were crushed. Their leaders fled to Berlin. But after the war, when the Western powers withdrew, the Soviets moved in, and adjusting from the Nazi model to the Soviet model didn't require any great changes. That is the political history of the region. That is the history of the kind of dictatorship, the police state, the one-party state with the party as an instrument of indoctrination and repression. So you say, very well then, but without that, what was it like? Now, certainly, the history of the Middle East is not democratic. They did not develop democratic institutions of the kind that we find in Europe, even in the Middle Ages. But there are certain other things which give hope. One of them is the notion of limited authority. The Islamic tradition insists very strongly in rejecting despotism. The Arabic term is istibdad, despotism. And it is always used, even in early classical texts, in a very negative sense. Government is to be consultative and limited. The Quran says consult them, meaning consult people in matters. The stress on consultation is very strong right through the classical Islamic tradition. So too is the stress on the limitation of authority. In the old Ottoman Empire, when a new sultan was enthroned, he was greeted by the people with cries of Padishah, don't be proud, God is greater than you are. If you'd like it in Turkish, Padishah, Mağrur olmaz, and then büyük Allah var. This tradition was not by any means a purely theoretical one. From descriptions from outside, we know that the traditional Muslim ruler did in fact have to consult, not with an elected consultative assembly, but rather with certain established interests. The merchant guilds and the bazaar, the craft guilds, the country gentry, the military, the religious establishment, and so on. Each of these was an organization. Each of these, and this is a very important point, each of these produced its own leadership from within, not nominated from above. And the system of consultation did function effectively in the pre-modern societies of the Middle East. It didn't always. Sometimes things went wrong and a tyranny was established. And we have two alternative traditions in Muslim political thought, one of which insists on limited authority and consultation, and their dictum is a saying attributed to the Prophet, there is no obedience in sin. In other words, if the ruler orders something which is contrary to the law of God, the duty of obedience lapses and is replaced not by a right of disobedience as in Western thought, but a duty of disobedience. As against that, there is the fact that quite frequently rulers did establish themselves as tyrants, and there is an alternative tradition, which again is well documented in Islamic political writings and thoughts, of the principle that tyranny is better than anarchy. Put up with any tyrant, however awful, if the alternative is a relapse into complete chaos. What I'm trying to point out is that the Islamic tradition of government, of authority, is much more varied than would appear from the current general discussion. And it does contain a number of different possibilities, with which, of course, learned Muslims and even some less learned Muslims are acquainted. Finally, I turn to the one part of the Middle East that hasn't figured at all in my discussions hitherto. That is a little country called Israel. And here, as my time has run out, I shall limit myself to what I see as the two dangers that confront Israel at the present time. And both of them are very serious. One, of which everyone I think is aware, acutely conscious, is the external danger, more particularly the danger from a nuclear-armed Iran, which is more than a possibility, a probability in the not-too-distant future. And the other, to which I would wish to draw your attention more particularly, is the internal danger. And here I would like to use my remaining few minutes to draw attention to what seem to me to be the two most dangerous trends in Israel at the present time. One of them is in the field of education. I'm speaking not so much of university education as of primary and secondary education. How shall I put it, the decline in respect, standards for school teachers, the decline of that profession is having devastating consequences, and this can only get worse unless something is done about it. The other, which I see as a danger, is not new, but it continues, and that is the electoral system. Israel did succeed in establishing what is probably the worst electoral system in the free world, one which is carefully designed to give special influence to very minor troublesome factions. In a constituency system on the British or American model, you wouldn't have a multiplicity of parties. You would have two or at the most three parties which are able to command support all over the country, and you would have a possibility of genuine functioning democracy. But that hasn't happened. And I remember some time ago, an attempt was made to modify the system and by the direct election of the Prime Minister. And I was asked my opinion at the time, and I said, well, you already have the worst electoral system in the free world, and now with true Jewish ingenuity, you have succeeded in doing something which I wouldn't have thought possible. You have found a way to make it even worse. Fortunately, that particular change has been remedied, but I would urge you to think carefully about the needs of the future, particularly these two, education and election. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard, for this wonderful lecture. Spoke about the past, the present, the future. You mentioned education. Well, after all, you know, when we spoke, I think it was in September, discussing your lectures here, and I did mention to you that the second lecture, this lecture actually was supposed to happen after the semester. You know, the first semester was supposed to be ended last week. And we spoke about how awful is that the student will not be able to come and attend this lecture, but as you can see, we, the professors here in the university, took care of it and went on strike, and actually the first semester started yesterday, so I see here many of our students, and at least anyhow we still have a few minutes for questions and answers, so do please. Anyone who wishing to ask, please.
Two questions. One, you spoke of the internal forces within the Middle East. You didn't mention the divisions between the Sunnis and the Shiites per se. How do you see their role and that division in the ongoing process? That's one question. The second, you described the traditional Muslim Islamic approach to governance, but do you see any forces, or can you define any forces that would be acting toward moving those traditional approaches back into the Muslim society? Can they possibly replace the grip of the autocratic mentality that currently seems to hold power in the Muslim world?
First the Sunni Shia question. This is obviously an important one, but I have the feeling that it's becoming less important now. Remember that it's only an issue for Muslims in countries where both exist. If you travel, for example, in Muslim Africa, from Egypt all the way across to Morocco or southwards into Sudan, it's not an issue at all. There are no Shia there, they don't know what it is. I remember being asked by one person, an educated Egyptian, saying, am I a Sunni or a Shiite? Just didn't know what it was about. It's an issue where you have both, as in Iraq and in Pakistan. It was particularly an issue in Iraq because you had a Shiite majority and a Sunni ascendancy. I borrow the word from Irish history. Sunni domination of a Shiite majority, which has gone on for centuries. And that has obviously been a very major issue and a very sensitive issue in Iraq. But I have the impression that elsewhere in the Muslim world, except in those areas where they exist side by side, Iraq is one, Pakistan another, it's not a major issue. As I told you, in Indonesia, a solidly Sunni country, they were celebrating the Iranian Revolution. Certainly in Iraq, very important, and possibly else, one or two other places, but not a major Muslim issue. The second one, remind me?
The reform, the traditional Islamic approach to governance.
Yeah.
What mechanism could this emerge to replace what's presently dominant?
This is very difficult because people in most Muslim countries know that if they express this kind of opinion publicly, they will be in deep trouble. And this does have a certain deterrent effect. Nevertheless, I have been astonished and delighted at the extent to which such opinions are being expressed even openly during the last few years. I mean, you now have people in Egypt even, and in some other countries who come out openly and talk about the need for democratization, and even more outrageous from their point of view, the need for good relations with Israel. And you now have people in Iraq, in Egypt, and elsewhere, who will tell you that the advent of Israel has been an unexpected boon and blessing to the Arab world, giving them a working democracy in the very heart of the region, a model to follow, an example, and that the Arab population of Israel can serve as an example of a successful experiment. This is not a view which is widely expressed for obvious reasons, but it is expressed. One meets people who talk like that, and I find this encouraging. And the fact that they dare to say so publicly means that they also feel that there is a change.
Yes, please. If you can stand up.
Of the Middle East.
You can stand up. Okay. Okay, sorry.
What is your conception of Middle East? Middle East starts where and ends where? In your speech, you went all the way to Malaysia and China and India. Where does it start, this Middle East, and where does it end?
No, I did not mean to say that China and India are part of the Middle East any more than that Europe and the United States are part of the Middle East. I talked of these as external factors affecting the Middle East. And the term Middle East, you are quite right, is very inaccurate and very misleading. I remember some years ago visiting an American organization which called itself the American Friends of the Middle East. And I was surprised to find that the area to which they offered their friendship began in Morocco and went all the way to Indonesia. And I said, well, what exactly do you mean by the Middle East? And they said, oh, well, the middle part of the Eastern Hemisphere. That is not the usual interpretation. The Near East was the first term. And for a long time, it was simply the East or the Orient. And for Europeans, that meant the Near East, because they were barely aware of a more distant East. And when people talked about the Eastern question, for example, they meant the Ottoman Empire. Then, as Europe became aware of a more distant East beyond the horizons, they started to talk of the Near East, a term which came into use in the course of the 19th century. The Middle East was invented by an American admiral at the beginning of the 20th century. And then a number of institutions decided to play it safe by combining the two in the Near and Middle East, avoiding the need to say which is near and which is middle. One reason perhaps for calling it the Middle East is that it turned out not to be quite as near as they thought. In India, when India became independent, they strongly objected to the Middle East, or Near East. They said quite rightly, this is a Eurocentric view. I mean, this is defining a region by looking at it from London, or Paris maybe, but not much else. And they said this is unacceptable. So they instead coined the term West Asia, which unfortunately has the disadvantage of leaving out Egypt. Now, some people might want to leave Egypt out of the Middle East, but that's hardly practicable. The term Near and Middle East now continues in use. Near and Middle East or Middle East. Near East has almost disappeared. And the usual definition of it is the heartlands of it are Egypt and the Levant. Then from the Levant it goes on and includes Turkey, Iraq, the Arabian Peninsula. And from Egypt it goes westwards all the way to Morocco and southwards to the Sudan. And some people go further than that. It's also been penetrating southwards from Morocco to Mauritania. Latterly there's been another addition to the Middle East with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Islamic republics of the former Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and the rest of them, they are in Central Asia. They are now considered also part of the Middle East. And that is not unreasonable. Historically, culturally, they belong with the Middle East, with the Arabic, Persian, and Turkish-speaking lands. The term Near and Middle East is very much used even in South and Southeast Asia, though from their point of view it's not too distant west. But these have become the accepted terms, and I think those would be more or less generally accepted definition at the present time.
Thank you. Yes, I think last question. Yeah.
I would like you, if possible, to make a declaration from the Lewis perspective of a brief history of your time on our earth as you've observed the relations between Muslim countries and other Western, European, or Middle Eastern. Whether there is a more important dynamic between Islam and Christianity and the Jewish nation, or whether there is really an anathema, if you will, an a priori, that democracy doesn't work in a Islamic state which seeks a powerful ruler, which even in Iran has a tension between Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, and whether you believe that religion is the problem among these nations, or whether it is simply a political tension over assets, real estate, and economic power. Short question.
Short question, and I'll give you a short answer. I will, if you permit, redefine the question slightly and say, is organized religion compatible with democracy in Islam or anywhere else? Would that be a fair summary? Yes, I think that is a crucial question. And if you look at it historically, not theoretically, but historically, take the question, say, is Christianity compatible with democracy? Well, then you have to start saying, well, we have to divide Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox. If we look at the record for Orthodox Christianity, you would have to say probably not. If you look at the record for Catholic Christianity, you'd have to say very mixed. If you look at the record for Protestant Christianity, then you'd say, yes, pretty good, if we forget about Nazi Germany and one or two other things like that. And Hitler wasn't brought up as a Protestant, of course. I think the question should be put in larger terms. Is democracy compatible with organized religion? And I think the answer there is no. And that is why secularism was developed and the notion of the separation of church and state, which serves the double purpose of preventing the church from using the power of the state to enforce its doctrines and preventing the state from interfering in the affairs of the church. The separation of church and state was really the result of the shattering experience of the religious wars in Europe, those long and bitter wars between Protestants and Catholics that went on for centuries and which finally led to, shall we say, abandonment of the whole idea and disgust and the acceptance of the idea of a separation between them. In Islam, except in Turkey, where Islam was formally disestablished, and where there is no established religion, at least I haven't seen this morning's papers yet. There wasn't last time I looked. In the Jewish state, it's not at all clear. I would ask you that question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Lois. And we will see you next year.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you. I think it was great, really. Thank you.